Welcome to the 100,000 subscriber YouTube special. Today we're doing a Q&A. I reached out for some questions, and I got some very good ones. I also got some really touching and heartfelt congratulations, so thank you all for those. They were very sweet. Our first question is from Jordan. At what point in the process do you recommend recurving the limbs? I think I've done mine a little too early in the past, causing splintering and wrecking a couple of bows. Or maybe I just didn't boil them long enough. I've definitely ruined plenty of bows by recurving them too thick and causing the cracking. What I like to do to prevent that is make sure that I have a good floor tiller before recurving. I don't like to recurve too late in the process, just because recurving is a big risk, and I like to get that over with pretty soon. You do have to get the limbs thin enough to survive the bending, but even if you try to recurve too thick, sometimes they'll crack just to the right thickness, and by the time you remove the cracks, you'll be left with the perfect amount of thickness. I don't like to give absolute advice about the thickness, but with stiff woods, it's often going to be thinner than you expect. If you've been watching videos where people are recurving Osage, you can get away with bending pretty thick limbs, but if you're using something like hickory, you're going to have 30, 40, even 50% less thickness. With white woods in general, you want to heat treat the bend. With woods like Osage, you can steam bend, and the bend will be locked already and it'll be stable. But with a lot of white woods, if you pull on the bend, they'll pull out and straighten out. So you want to be heat treating the bends on white wood so that they stay. So overall, I'd say I heat treat after the floor tiller once the limbs are tapered, well established, and they're bending throughout. Another tip for bending recurves is that I like to chase a ring on the belly side. Usually the belly's under compression, but when you're bending recurves, the belly's going to be in the weird position of being under tension. So sometimes if you have feathering growth rings, that can encourage splinters to form. So along the very tip of the bow, where you're going to be doing the bending, sometimes I like to chase a growth ring for that length, and that helps ensure that there's tension strength in that area. I also like to put down a metal splinter over the belly, and that helps to take on some of the tension load, helps to hold down splinters, and keep everything secure. Our next question is from Glenn. Who or what inspired you to get into the hobby of bow making? I think I've always had the itch to do archery, just seeing it in movies and video games. I didn't really try to scratch that itch until my 20s when I bought a fiberglass bow on a whim. I think I was looking for a new hobby. But it really didn't scratch the itch. There was something unnatural about it. The way the limbs vibrated in a very metallic way just didn't appeal to me. Then I tried to make a bow, and it was an absolute disaster. The first one I made was completely unshootable. But I really liked the process of trying to make a better bow. It was actually a very humbling experience. I didn't really know anything about how bows worked. I didn't follow a tutorial. And I didn't really understand how brace height worked. So I thought that this was an engineering problem that I would, as a non-archer, somehow have a better solution to than everybody else who's been doing this for thousands of years. So I made a mechanism, and I made these nocks that you could rotate, and that would change the brace height of the bow. At the time, I didn't know that changing the brace height was trivial, and that you could do this just by twisting the string or by using a bowyer's knot, which is what I like to use today. So anyway, I made this complicated mechanism, very overcomplicated, and it worked horribly. Every time I would shoot the bow, the mechanism would break, and the nock would spin around like a weed whacker. It was a very silly bow. It wouldn't shoot. After that, I was pretty humbled, and I thought, okay, I'll look for a tutorial. And I found Sam Harper's video, Poor Folk Bows, and he makes a very good bore bow tutorial. It's backed with fiberglass, which I don't like to do today, but and I regretted doing that at the time. But I made a shooting bow. It didn't last too long. The fiberglass didn't really save the wood. But I really enjoyed the tutorial. I really enjoyed the process of making a bow. And I was hooked at that point. And then I got the Bowyer's Bibles, and I was completely hooked. I really got the bug. Those books are very special, and they really appealed to me deep down. They made me want to be a bowyer. And I didn't stop making bows after that. I kept at it. Our next question is from Erica Swallow. What historic bow-making techniques span across cultures? Are there any that are super unique to a specific location, not found anywhere else? Well, one of my favorite examples of a very unique bow design are the Andaman Islands bows, which have reflex on one limb and deflex on the other, so when you look at them from the side, they have an S shape. I think these bows are super interesting because we often show up with these preconceived notions that bows have to be symmetrical or some particular shape, and they really don't. Often you'll make bows with very weird profiles that still shoot an arrow straight and really hard. Clearly, these bowyers knew what they were doing because they used very advanced front profile shape. These like Eiffel Tower limb profiles are very advanced and a great way to store energy without having excessive tip weight. So clearly these folks knew what they were doing, and this was no kind of mistake. I'm very curious about what their explanation would be for why the limbs are shaped like that. I've heard a lot of ideas, and I don't really want to speculate because I think whatever I say will probably be wrong. Now, the other part of the question, what are some similarities of different bow designs across cultures? If you look at bows from temperate regions, from North America, from Europe, from Asia, the self bows are very similar. Bows from temperate regions tend to be very similar to the Sudbury bow or the Holmegard bow. These sort of flat bow designs are very archetypal, and you can find them all over the world. A lot of these innovations are longer limbs to accommodate for longer draw lengths, and wider limbs to accommodate stiffer woods. Take my answer with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert on history. I just make bows. Our next question is from Soulfully. What are the basic properties of wood, tree species in the area, and the decision tree a beginner would need to know to understand how bows work at a basic level, and to make design choices based on those properties and intended functions? Well, that's a pretty hard question. I could easily give a whole book of answer to that. I think if I had to distill my answer, it would be that you actually don't have to bow design. I'd recommend following a tutorial instead of designing your own bow. Designing bows for beginners can easily turn into reinventing the wheel and making the design worse. So I'd suggest just using designs that already exist and are proven over thousands of years. There's no need to be designing bows. It's a bit like learning to walk. If you have somebody that doesn't know how to walk yet, there's no need to drown them in medical textbooks on the physiology of walking. That's not the way that you learn to walk. And it's kind of the same with bows. The way to learn how to make bows is just to do it and kind of endure through a couple failures, if that happens. Now, if you follow tutorials and you really stick to the advice and don't deviate and try to design your own bow, then the odds of success are actually very high. Most of the failures in beginner bow design come from trying to design your own bow rather than following instructions that have worked for thousands and thousands of years. The other part of the question is, what are the basic properties of wood and tree species in the area? My advice around that is to Google your location plus bowwood, and you're going to find advice about historical bowwoods that work in your area, as well as maybe some introduced species that are good nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a huge understanding of the properties of wood in order to make a bow. As long as the wood you're using is known as a good bowwood and has a good reputation as bowwood, then you should be able to make a bow out of it. If you are going to be designing bows as a beginner, the main thing you want to be thinking about is adding margin for error, and not necessarily designing for performance, which is going to take away margin for error. You want to be making your bows longer and wider to maximize the amount of margin for error you have. With a little bit more experience, you're going to know how much you can get away with, and then you can start trimming back the length, making the bows a little bit narrower, and you'll still have a good chance to succeed. I do feel like I kind of dodged this question, just because I don't recommend designing bows until you really have a very good understanding of bow design. For a more thorough answer to this question, check out my video on the back of the bow. I include a big decision tree that walks you through exactly what you have to do, depending on the kind of wood you're starting with. Our next question is from Matt R.N. Mora. What's the best tool you use to get even limb edges? Do you just use a draw knife and a rasp, or is a spoke shave much more refined? I do mostly use a draw knife and a rasp. I also switch to the spoke shave sometimes. They help you when you start to lose control with the draw knife because they're basically like a draw knife but with a depth stopper that prevents you from cutting too deep. I'll say that the tool you're using isn't that important as long as it's under control. The most important thing is your fingers. I'm not using calipers or anything like that to measure the thickness of the bow, but I do slide around my fingers looking for spots that are relatively thick. Now, fingers are surprisingly very good at detecting spots that are a little bit thicker than the rest of the limb. So, if you're feeling down the limb and there's a spot that's suddenly a little bit thicker, that's really easy to notice with your fingers, and you should really listen to that and take advantage of that kind of input, because there's no tool that can measure so precisely. Yes, calipers are better at measuring the absolute thickness of the limb, but sliding calipers around, they're not very good for measuring relative thickness of the limbs. Your fingers are way, way better at finding sudden thick spots along the limb. So that's what I use, and that's, I think, all that you need to keep the limbs good enough in terms of relative limb thickness. Our next question is from Juan Baldonedo. Could you make a video showing briefly different woods, separating them into tension strong and compression strong, and other features that are important when building a bow? Any tips for dealing with character bows would be appreciated. I actually do have videos on those topics. Check out my video on my favorite bow wood, and also my video on tillering. In the tillering video, I go over some tips, tricks, and hacks for dealing with unusual character bows that may be difficult to tiller with normal methods. And I also have some diagrams for how to deal with knots and wiggles in the stave and all those kinds of things. Now, I feel like I've kind of dodged that question, so I'll talk a little bit about how I personally approach knots and character in bows. And I don't actually think of them any differently than other bows. I'm always trying to follow the grain as much as possible. And so that kind of universal approach lets character staves fold in naturally to the same step-by-step approach I'm taking already. As far as bow wood qualities go, check out my video on my favorite bow woods, where I talk about my 10 favorite bow woods and break them into tension strong, compression strong, and their different qualities, and how I approach them individually. I think watching that video, you'll get a general sense of how bowyers approach different kinds of woods. Now, if you're dealing with some kind of mystery wood you don't know how to approach, my advice would be to look up primitive archer plus the mystery bow wood you're dealing with. And you're probably going to get some forum advice on whether bowyers think this is a heartwood or a sapwood, and how they approach this bow wood individually. If I had to summarize and distill my advice about dealing with different kinds of bow woods, in a nutshell, more flexible woods can survive being made into more narrow designs, like English longbows. You need a really flexible wood like yew. Now, if you're dealing with a stiffer wood like hickory, you generally want to be making wider limbs, and those are going to tend to have thinner bellies. Our next question is from Travis George. For all the different types of bows, like English longbows, Paiute flatbows, Mongolian horsebows, etc., do you get to learn about those cultures from the construction process, like why they use certain materials or how effective the form is for certain situations? On the one hand, I'd say you don't necessarily have to learn about a culture to make their bows. You can treat this as physics and engineering, and sort of removed from culture if you want. On the other hand, it's hard not to get intoxicated by the process and absolutely fascinated with the people who were making these thousands of years before you. For me, that's certainly the case. I've had experiences looking at bows in museums and thinking, wow, I understand. I really relate to you, and I get what you were doing thousands of years ago. I understand what you were going for. Okay, our next question is from Booglebow. I'd love to hear how you got into bow making, what it's taken for you to make a living as one, and what are your personal top 3 historic bow designs. Also would love to see which of your own bows you're happiest with. Well, I think my favorite bows that I've made are the hornbeam hollow limb design. Despite all the character, I shoot that bow a bunch, and it's a very reliable shooter. Also, the hickory sapling recurve I'm about to post a build-along for. This is a bow I thought was a failure, but I came back to it after a few years and ended up rescuing the project. So I'm really glad that one ended up working out in the end. And of the hundreds of bows I have, when I go out to shoot, that's the one I tend to pick. Okay, my 3 favorite historical bow designs. I'm going to have to go with the Andaman Islands design, I think because it's so interesting. I already talked about that one a little bit. And then also the Holmegard and Sudbury bows. I think because they're very representative of flat bows from temperate forests, which is what I feel the most kinship with. Regarding making a living as a bowyer, I don't necessarily recommend it. It's a pretty rocky road. I don't sell bows anymore because I don't exactly have a passion for dealing with customers, but I am really passionate about teaching bow making and making educational content. I really enjoy that. If you're going to do YouTube, I'd suggest doing it just because you really enjoy making videos about bow making. It takes a while for the monetization to kick in, and when it does, it's just a trickle. Our next question is from Kiriki Kun. How long it takes to make a simple bow? I feel like I did my second one in 5 to 6 hours. Is that too quick? I've made bows in half an hour and I've made bows in 100 hours plus. It really depends on the project. You can make a very simple PVC or greenwood bow in under an hour, and there's no reason you have to spend any more. Once you're dealing with properly dried wood, then it takes me anywhere from, 5 to 10 hours for a very simple bow. Now, when you throw in heat treating and straightening and all the bells and whistles, I'm easily spending 40 hours plus. I think if you want to make your first bow and you want it to be a sort of professional quality, nice hunting bow, I would budget around 40 hours for that. Now, that said, if you're making a simple bow, there's no reason you have to spend very long. If you're making a bow in 5 hours and you're happy with the results, then good for you. You don't need to spend any longer. Okay, our next question is from Noob Bowyer. Does it matter if you chased a different growth ring on one limb of the bow than on the other limb, assuming that the bow has a stiff handle? This is a great question. If it's a bending handle bow, you definitely want to chase one growth ring across the whole bow. But for a stiff handle, you don't really have to. I've actually done this several times. Usually I hide the transition with a handle wrap, so I don't have any way to show you in a way that would demonstrate the different growth rings along the back. But all I'll say is, yeah, you can absolutely do this. There's no reason you have to chase the exact same growth ring on a stiff-handled bow. Now, if you can chase the same growth ring, I recommend it. Mostly that's for aesthetic reasons, but there's probably also a little bit less risk of a splinter lifting at the fades. So mostly I like to chase a whole growth ring if I can, but there are plenty of situations where it makes sense to chase a different growth ring for both limbs. That's totally fine. Our next question is from Utopian Aspirant. We talk a lot about the possibility of breaking bows, especially for beginners, and especially if the design or execution isn't quite right for the desired weight or material. How dangerous is breaking a bow? How much testing would you put one of your bows through before you handed it to someone else to use? When a bow's finished, I like to put it through at least 200 or 300 test shots just to make sure the bow's at equilibrium and has taken as much set as it's going to take. If the bow's stable at that point, it's probably safe to hand off. Is breaking a bow dangerous? Usually not as much as you would think. Especially with tension-strong whitewoods, they tend to break in a way where they're not separating into multiple pieces, and you get kind of a slow crumpling rather than an explosion. Breaking bows can be a little bit more dangerous if you're dealing with a board bow that has bad grain violation, because then you'll get sharp fragments that are exploding a little bit more violently. But even in those cases, it's often less dangerous than you would think, just because the energy is moving outwards away from you. Now, you can get hit. Some pieces will kind of hinge around and swing back at you, but it's not as common. In most cases, the fragments are going outwards. I do recommend wearing some safety glasses if you're going to be tillering the bow by hand. And that's just going to give you more confidence about pulling the bow to full draw and not being a little bit gun shy about drawing the bow all the way back. So I've broken about 2 bows in the hand and a few more than that on the tiller tree, other than the ones I broke on purpose. And in general, it was less scary than you think. Most of these kind of crumpled rather than exploding. I did have one that broke kind of explosively. It was a sassafras bow that broke into 6 or 7 pieces, but most of the fragments moved outwards and it ended up not being very dangerous. If you want to see some examples of breakage and what it's like when it happens, check out my How to Break a Bow series, where I have some video footage of breaking bows on the tiller tree, just showing what it's like. Our next question is from More Dog, More Nog. Do some species not show crescals when the belly experiences compression failure? I've noticed that some of my bows, when overdrawn, will take string follow and lose draw weight, but the belly remains completely clear. I think some species are definitely more susceptible than others. My understanding is that when the bow takes set, the fibers on the belly are actually crumpling, and compression fractures or crescals are just a more extreme, more visible example of that if you take it a little further. I think in general, it can happen to any wood if you draw them far enough, but some woods are more susceptible than others, and it's easier to happen with certain woods. Whenever you're dealing with a new bow wood, I would suggest playing with the shavings. Just bending some pieces of shavings in your hand can tell you about when different bow woods break in tension, when they start to take set, and when you'll get compression fractures. Our next question is from Varangian Bowyer. What is the weirdest bow wood you've ever worked with? I'm going to have to say it's Viburnum lintego. The Viburnum genus is really common for arrowwoods, but there's this species around me that grows a little bit bigger, and it tends to grow in swamps. Has this creamy white sapwood and sherry-colored heartwood, just like yew, so it actually is a pretty good imitation yew wood. It's really nice to carve, has good bending properties, but the weird thing about it is that it has this awful smell that will stink up your whole shop. It smells like, dirty wet socks that you left in a plastic bag and let get mildewy. Really foul. It's awful. Our next question is from Small AD 9599. If someone wanted to start bow making, and maybe from there also go into making arrows, what tools would you recommend them to buy? So at a minimum, you need a tool that removes a lot of wood, and a tool that removes just a little bit. The beginner kit that I usually recommend for bow making is a draw knife, a rasp, and a scraper. I think the scraper is the most important tool. At some level, it doesn't really matter how you remove the wood. It's more about what wood you remove and why. So as long as you have some kind of bulk removal tool, whether it's a draw knife or a hatchet or a big machete, it's nice to have some kind of medium removal tool that ignores the grain. So a rasp is great for that. Any kind of wood rasp or a Shinto rasp is something I really recommend, or a farrier's rasp works very well. If you're going to get into arrow making, you want to get a block plane, and you also want to make a shooting board. Now here's some optional extras that you could add later on in the process. A spoke shave is really nice to have because it's like a draw knife with a depth stop. It's great to have a chainsaw file for the nocks. You could use a knife or a carving knife to do the nocks, but it's nice to have a thin file. A Shinto rasp is very handy because they don't really get clogged. And of course a burnishing rod. If you don't have a burnishing rod, you're probably going to have to use 90-degree edges on your scraper. But once you have a burnishing rod, you can roll really good burrs, and so you're going to get amazing shavings with very little effort. Something else I like to use are chisels and gouges. They're really handy, but not really something you need when you start. Our next question is from Alisand. Do you conceive of hunting bows any differently than bows that aren't intended to be used for hunting? Is there anything about the design, material, etc. that you would optimize for hunting? Or is a good bow, regardless of its intended use? That's a really good question. Definitely you can optimize bows for different functions. But that's not really something I think about too much, because most of the bow designs I make were originally designed as hunting bows. So I don't really have to go out of my way to make something a hunting bow. That said, some bows definitely are better for target archery, or flight shooting, or clout, or whatever else. But in general, if a bow is powerful enough for hunting and you're comfortable carrying it through the woods, and you can shoot it accurately, then there's no reason you can't use it for hunting. Our next question is from Stumpy Black Dog. How do you source good staves for making bows? I know I'm probably not going to find many native plants suitable because I'm in Southern California, but I want to get back into it, and I don't know where to find good wood. Well, I cut almost all of my staves because I can, except for specialty woods like Osage, which I have to buy. If you live in an area without a lot of good bow wood, your best bet is probably to befriend a local arborist. A lot of cities will plant ornamental trees that end up being very good bow wood, and arborists will have access to cut limbs or occasional trees that have to come down. If you live in an area that does have good bow wood, but you just don't have access to cut it, then look for abandoned saplings that are in unwanted areas, like the side of the road, abandoned lots, construction projects where everything's going to get taken down. There's plenty of wood out there that nobody will care if you cut. Also, if you see some nice wood on a private property, I'd suggest taking some chances and knocking on doors. You'd be surprised how positive and curious people are about the craft. I've heard a lot of good examples of people being willing to help. Our next question is from Mirden. When exploring new woods, what stats should we look for to determine if it's worth investigating as a possible bow? Is Janka the main stat you use, or do you look at things like modulus of rupture and elasticity as well? Well, the stats tell you what the bow wood will be like, on average, and assuming that the stats are representative of a good sample. You do want to see a high modulus of rupture and a high crushing strength. The high modulus of rupture tells you that the wood's going to be hard to break in tension, and the high crushing strength hints that the bow wood is going to be pretty resistant on the belly. You do want to see a high Jenka hardness. That's good for drag through the brush durability. It tells you that the wood's going to be hard to dent and hard to scratch. Now, elastic modulus is a little bit more complicated. It's not good or bad either way, it just tells you what type of bow wood you're dealing with. If the wood has a low elastic modulus, that means you can make a narrow longbow, sort of like English longbows. Now, if the wood has a high elastic modulus, that means it's very stiff, and you're going to want to make a wider flat bow. Our next and final question is from BirdBeast1. The only tools I have to make a bow are a hatchet and a pocket knife. Is it possible to build a fair quality bow with just these? Yeah, absolutely. All you really need is a tool that removes a lot of wood and one that removes just a little bit. You want to have a sharp hatchet and to be pretty good at using it, but as long as you have a hatchet, a machete, a draw knife, something that can take big chunks, then you'll be fine for the bulk wood removal. Now, you want to have something that can take controlled shavings or, control little cuts, and a pocket knife is just fine for that. You also want to use the pocket knife as a scraper so that you can control the way the bow is bending. All right, folks, that is all for today. If you have any more questions, leave them down in the comments. And if you like this format, we can make it a regular thing. I'll see you all in the next one, and until then, may your arrows fly true.